So we're going to start with our legislative update with Marshall, and then Fabian Armijo is going to talk to us a little bit about some efforts happening at UNM, and then we're hoping to be joined by Alri Nelson from the Navajo Nation, and those will be our three presentations for this section, after which we'll take another little break. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Robert. Good morning again, everybody. I'm Marshall Martinez. I'm the Executive Director of Equality New Mexico, and I'm here to talk about the super fun, exciting, not at all anxious or stressful topic of LGBTQ policy and reproductive health care policy in a post-Roe world. I continuously say post-Roe because I refuse to mention the sham of a Supreme Court decision that was issued earlier this year that was built on almost no real legal precedent under any circumstances, but also to be able to make sure that folks remember, because I think so many people know, we lived in a world for 50 years where basic bodily autonomy was guaranteed constitutionally because of Roe. It's what people know it as. It's what most of us, many of them, I'm looking around the room, many of us, the world we were born and raised in, certainly most of us spent the majority of our lives in this world, right? And in the course of, a couple of days with a unfortunate leak a month in advance to prepare, or for those of us who have been doing this work for a long time, multiple years to prepare for, changed overnight, right? And what I know from my years of work in reproductive health care, access, policy, and politics, and also being professionally queer for 2 years and personally so for many, many more, is that fear, anger, anxiety, and more than anything, confusion, I think, is what swept each and every one of our communities, right? And so this conversation today is intended to do a couple of things. One, it is intended to be a conversation. It's intended to do a couple of things. One, hopefully to settle the confusion for folks in New Mexico about where we are right now. And because I'm a community organizer and a fire sign, and I'm short, I don't do well just sitting in anxiety. I like action. And so the other intention of this conversation is to give folks a place and a way to focus that anxious energy, that anger, that frustration, so that we come out of this situation that we're in right now in a better place than where we started, right? So I am not Kayla Herring, the current Director of Public Affairs for Planned Parenthood of the Rocky Mountains in New Mexico, but Kayla is a good friend of mine. We worked together for many years at Planned Parenthood. She did apologize profusely that she could not be here. I do want to make sure that folks know, and her contact information will be at the end of the presentation. She is a brilliant, amazing organizer and strategist and a really fun person. And so I apologize that you're stuck with just me this morning, but I'm able to cover both topics in this conversation, as Robert said, and as I mentioned, because I had that role for close to 5 years at Planned Parenthood. This is actually me. So I'm Marshall Martinez, I'm the Executive Director of Equality New Mexico. I was born and raised in Alamogordo, New Mexico. And as I say to folks all the time, I come from multiple generations of fierce, strong, badass women and the men who were smart enough to spend some of their life with them for a little while. And I think they deserve a little bit of credit. But the women deserve almost all of the credit for creating me and making me the person that I am here. So I just want to share two really quick stories about that sort of weave all of this together. So in 2003, in probably the second week of March, at roughly 1 o'clock in the morning, in the circular building of doom that most of us refer to as the Roundhouse, the New Mexico House of Representatives was about to take a vote for the first time under a Democratic governor on whether or not to add sexual orientation and gender identity to the state's Non-Discrimination Act. And I was a much, 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 much younger person then, and I won't say how old I was then or how old I am now, but it was my first legislative session ever to be involved in. And so at 1 o'clock in the morning, I'm downstairs, not on the floor, because I was not and will never be a representative, but was down and just outside in the hallway. And I saw all of these one-on-one conversations happening. They were debating some other piece of legislation. I'm sure it was critical and important, but I don't remember what it was. And individual legislators were coming off of the floor one at a time and having all of these conversations. And they were having face-to-face one-on-one conversations with people who were mostly, obviously, queer and trans folks. And what they were hearing were the stories of discrimination that those folks had faced in their jobs, in their housing, bakeries and car dealerships and all of these things. And I was watching these people's faces change. And then I was watching our lobbyist get a little, for folks who don't know, Linda Siegel, our lobbyist was getting a little less crazed looking. I don't know that I would ever say she didn't look crazed in that moment, but less and less crazed as she went on, right? And then the second story that I will say, and that bill passed, by the way, I'll talk about that. Second story I will share is that in 2004, I went to the March for Women's Lives in DC, which was the last sort of big pro-abortion access rally in hopes to not re-elect a Republican president, right? And so I went to this big giant march and it was amazing. This like little queer kid from this tiny town in New Mexico was in DC and I'm with all these like amazing feminists and so all these like pro-abortion access signs on the plane and all of this stuff. And I come home and I'm sharing this experience with multiple people in my family, one-on-one. And every one of those people in my family shared a personal abortion story with me. And every one of them said the same thing. Don't tell anybody in our family. And I learned in both of those two stories together, I learned more than anything else, the power of storytelling to change the world we live in and the power of stigma to take our power away from us. Almost every woman in my family had a story about abortion access, and every one of them was afraid to tell the other women in our family. That is abortion stigma in action. That's what happens when we don't talk about it. And every one of those legislators who voted on that non-discrimination bill in 2003 had no concept, no understanding, no real connection to non-discrimination around gender identity. Many of them were like, I've never met a trans person before. This was 2003, right, y'all? Like, this was 20 years ago. And then hearing those stories, they understood why this was critical for them to take the right vote and the way it impacted other people's lives. Right? And so I say that to say that at Equality New Mexico, our mission is to do a handful of things. First and foremost, we work in policy work from a harm reduction standpoint. Policy will never achieve liberation for queer and trans people. These systems weren't built by us, they weren't built for us, they are never going to liberate us. But they do govern our lives on a daily basis, and at the very least, we can do the best we can to approach them from a harm reduction standpoint. We're not going to end oppression, but we can try to minimize it to the best of our ability. We do that through the framework of intersectionality. There is no such thing as a queer issue and a not queer issue. We are ubiquitous. Queer folks need access to abortion, and trans folks need a living wage, right? Like, we know all of these things to be true. So we approach all of these issues from an intersectional framework. And the third thing is that we do culture and system shift work and policy work always in service of two things: to build more power and shift the system at the same time. We don't believe that passing a policy quietly and simply accomplishes anything for queer and trans folks, right? Because it's just words on a piece of paper. But when we take 500 folks into the roundhouse and we storm that place and we scare the hell out of those 112 legislators, they do the right thing, and then they follow up to make sure that that policy is implemented in the right way. And we continue to build power so that when those attacks come back at us later, they have less and less of a chance of being successful. So that's the way we do that work, and that's the way I'm hoping to frame this conversation for you all today. So, post-Roe landscape in New Mexico. How many folks heard that Roe had fallen and then immediately heard gay marriage is going next? Folks remember that message? EQ&M's phone was ringing off the hook, mostly with cisgender queer folks who were married who said, oh my God, what are you going to do to save my marriage? And I'm just going to be honest with y'all. Every one of those phone calls, I said, we'll talk about that later. Right now, what are we going to do about the people whose lives are in danger because they cannot access abortion care? Right? Like, let's be real about the imminent danger in Texas and in Arizona and in what has ended up to be 25 states across the country where folks' access to safe and legal abortion care has been stripped or completely suppressed to the point that it's not practical anymore, right? Well, marriage equality in New Mexico is and will continue to be safe because it's a constitutionally protected right in the state of New Mexico, and in fact, had been decided as such prior to the Obergefell decision in 2015, right? We have a Non-Discrimination Act in New Mexico. It is not perfect, and I'll talk about some loopholes, right? But it protects folks from discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity in housing, employment, and public accommodation across the state, and that has been true since Governor Richardson signed it into law in 2003, right? New Mexico was fortunate to have never passed HIV criminalization laws, right? Which is actually kind of huge because most states passed some form of HIV criminalization law at some point. We actually were the second or third, the records seem to be all over the place, but we were of the top 5 folks to repeal our anti-sodomy laws in this state. And that happened almost 30 years before we had any queer people in any openly queer people in our legislature. I guess I should be a little more clear about that, right? And so, but that was a fight led by our allies for us at a time where we didn't have much of an organized or coherent or effective movement in New Mexico, right? A couple of other things that, that make us really great. The Office of the Superintendent of Insurance has declared that every insurance company in New Mexico must provide at least one PrEP medication without a copay. So
the strongest, no trans discrimination bulletin.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you, Adrian, for reminding me, because I knew as I was prepping this on election night, I would never do that, and doing 5 things at once, right? But the Office of the Superintendent of Insurance actually has done a lot of really phenomenal things, right? Insurance companies are regulated to an almost equitable standard in New Mexico, which is really great, right? But also we know, and we just have to acknowledge, that LGBTQ friendly or affirming providers are severely limited in New Mexico, right? So we have great rules and laws around access to PrEP, but the reality is most folks can't actually access PrEP in New Mexico because they can't find a provider, they don't know how to talk to their provider about it, they live in rural communities, all of those sorts of things, right? What is the state of New Mexico's landscape on reproductive health care? In 2019, we passed the Contraceptive Equity Act that said a number of things. One of them said that insurance companies must cover contraception at an equitable rate, no matter what type of contraception it is. One of my favorite things about that is that you can request and must be given reimbursement for the purchase of over-the-counter contraceptives like condoms from your insurance company. I don't know a whole lot of 22-year-olds who go and then keep the receipt and then submit it to an insurance company. But as we become older, more responsible adults, maybe we do those sorts of things, right? In 2021, after 5 years of work, we passed the New Mexico Women and Families Act, which was the repeal of New Mexico's pre-Roe abortion ban. That was critical. It had been on the books for all of this time. It had not been enforced for all of this time. Again, many of us who worked in repro spaces saw the fall of Roe coming for a really long time and said, we have to get this off the books so we're not like all of those other states for whom an abortion ban immediately went into effect when that decision was overturned, right? Medication abortion is available across New Mexico because of telehealth and access to telehealth. Obviously, there are some internet barriers, as we've seen even in Albuquerque on campus and in our neighborhoods recently during storms. So not everybody has full access to telehealth, but a majority of communities across the state can access medication abortion through that. Procedural abortions are only available in Albuquerque right now. That's really important to remember, especially as we start talking about provider shortages in a little while. And in good news, the governor has committed $10 million of funding for a full spectrum reproductive health center in Las Cruces, New Mexico. That is huge and amazing, right? The colonias in southern New Mexico, where folks are living without documentation or in mixed status, right? All of these people in these communities who, or in the West Texas communities, who need to go somewhere nearby, right, won't have to come. And also, just like the average person who needs access to reproductive health care can't always drive 4 hours to go get that access. For folks who didn't know, close to 50% of people who access abortion care already have children, right? Like that's the reality. So you gotta take time off work, you gotta have childcare, you gotta have gas in your car, you gotta have somebody to go with you, that's probably the childcare person, right? All of these things. So this funding down here is huge for Las Cruces. So, given all of that, there are 3 states in the country that are considered to have the most progressive LGBTQ and reproductive health care laws. Like, hands down, without competition. Anybody know what 3 states they are? What, somebody?
Is one of them us?
One of them is us. Yes. People think all the time, and Robert said this earlier, right? We're always hearing about what New Mexico doesn't have. New York, California, and New Mexico have the strongest LGBTQ and reproductive health care protections, laws, and regulations in the country. And I challenge people all the time, mostly because I'm at least partially brown, though I don't look like it, thanks Dad, from southern New Mexico, right? Grew up in a lower middle class family. All I've ever heard is New Mexico is so brown, it's so Catholic, it's so poor, it's so conservative. Yeah, we ain't had anti-sodomy laws since 1972. That does not sound conservative to me because there are states who still have them. We have a rich history in New Mexico of being more progressive than the vast majority of the country, especially when it comes to bodily autonomy issues, the creation and recognition of our families, and accessing the healthcare we need. And I think that that's something we should all be really, really proud of, and something we should remind the folks in Texas and Arizona and Georgia who are really frustrated after this week and looking for a new place to live, that like, hey, it's great here and the food is kick-ass. So the blind spots that we have, right? Insurance regulations are not law, unfortunately. We don't know how many of them will hold up in a legal battle. Right? The Office of the Superintendent of Insurance can issue these statements and issue these directives, and most folks just follow them. We don't actually know what will happen if an insurance company challenges them in court, right? So a loophole in the Human Rights Act in New Mexico, it prohibits discrimination in housing, employment, and public accommodation, but the original law was written in 1968, and they defined public accommodation according to what they understood at that time, and it doesn't include taxpayer-funded entities like, oh, I don't know, state government, or the city of Albuquerque. So legally in New Mexico, the provision of services from publicly funded entities like the state or like the city or like the county, they are not prohibited from discrimination. That's important because they are at the federal level, but the federal level doesn't include gender identity and sexual orientation. New Mexico state law does, right? So we have to fix that loophole. We do not have really any policy on gender-affirming healthcare access in New Mexico. Working in the repro field for a long time, that was where we wanted, right? We also didn't have any policy on abortion access, and no one policy works best in all situations. So a lack of policy is actually the best policy for us to accomplish equity, right? But that has started to change in the last few years as we start to see creative, interesting, evil, malicious attacks on our access to healthcare in local communities, in schools, in all of those places, right? That includes no clear regulation or law on the minimum age for gender-affirming healthcare, which leads to this confusion for providers in so many ways, which does not help the provider shortage problem, right? And the provider shortage is real. Right? I know we've heard it a couple of times. I told this story last year. I mean, granted, it was a long time ago, but it has taken me a long time just to find a primary care physician who's not uncomfortable when I talk about being queer and also relatively sexually promiscuous. And I'm okay with that, right? So and that's just primary care. But then we start thinking about the folks who need access to gender-affirming care. We start thinking about the folks who want access to PrEP, which is not that complicated, but apparently every doctor in the world thinks you have to be an HIV specialist to write a prescription every 6 months for somebody for a once-a-day pill, right? And so as we stack all of those provider shortages, and then we look at the reality of what is coming into New Mexico in terms of patient base, we are already in a healthcare crisis. That healthcare crisis is not going away in the next few years, right? We also have some stigmatizing language. For example, we have a state law that prohibits chiropractors from providing abortions. I don't know about anybody in this room. It never would have occurred to me to recommend to my baby sister that she go to a chiropractor in order to get an abortion. But this is like these are the types of attacks that our opposition puts out there because, of course, who doesn't want to make sure chiropractors aren't giving abortions? Well, like, yeah, I also don't want dentists or mechanics, right? Like, but they know that's not happening. They just put these bills out there so that they can continuously talk to people about how dangerous abortion is, right? About how special it is as a healthcare procedure, so that then they can continue to enforce the stigma, right? And that language adds to the stigma around abortion care, which adds to the people who don't want to share their abortion stories, which adds to the fact that these people keep building political power in and around and on top of our bodies, and it just continuously becomes more and more cyclical. Right?
It's like anti-trans student athlete bills, right?
Exactly.
Anytime it's a solution in search of a problem, they're just trying to get us.
That is exactly right. That is exactly right. And that's what we're seeing in all of these states now, that the model for them is to do what they did on abortion for 30 years on trans folks and on LGBT folks now too, right? Like those attacks are doubling up. Thanks, Ron DeSantis and other folks across the country, right? And all they're doing is figuring out the ways that they can spend 30 seconds on TV making everybody afraid of trans people, queer people, and abortion providers. We are all monsters, right? That's what they're trying to put out there. We also do have a partial birth abortion ban on statute in New Mexico. Fortunately, it was drafted in probably the best way possible. Back when we knew it was going to pass, we did everything we could to nuance the language in such a way that it hasn't had much of an impact on access, except that in this world today, as we're in the building of the medical school, knowing all of these things aren't defined, none of these things are specifically and explicitly protected, and we're hearing about patients and doctors having charges filed against them in other jurisdictions. How many medical students today are considering OBGYN specialties so they can go out and become abortion providers, right? How many of them thought about it when they were in college and now are like, yeah, I think I'd rather work on something much less scary, right? And at a time when we need abortion providers, gender-affirming care providers, just queer and trans-friendly people to be in the medical field more than ever, right? Because of all of these blind spots and these gaps. Folks have heard New Mexico is a safe harbor, right? And I am super proud. In fact, our opposition has been saying for the longest time in the world that we were on track to become the abortion capital of the world. I'll reserve my comments about that. But the reality is, you look at any map for abortion access, and I get so frustrated that we refused to put that map up here because I just can't look at it anymore. But the reality is, you've got a couple states on the East Coast, and then you have no access, and then you've got New Mexico, which is great, and then you have mostly good access in Colorado, mostly good access in Nevada, and then all of the rest of the Mountain West, and then California, right? And so for all of the folks in that surrounding area, we are the place where they can come to access abortion care, and we're starting to become the place where they can come to access gender-affirming healthcare as well. And let me tell you, when I say the healthcare crisis is not going to get better anytime soon, that's what I'm talking about. We already have a provider shortage, and it is in my belief, our moral responsibility to provide access to anyone who needs that care the second they arrive in our state and in our cities. So we can't turn anybody away, but we have to think really clearly about what are we doing to make sure that we give access to all of the folks in our rural communities and all of the folks who are traveling in, right? Luckily, we have super great trusted names and people who are really much smarter on healthcare access policy than I am at Planned Parenthood, right? Equality New Mexico has a pretty good brand, and so we've been working with the legislature and working at the executive level with the governor's office to really try to think creatively. But if I could plant a seed for folks, no idea is a bad idea, because like, y'all, we in a crisis, and I don't care how you put the fire out, just like whatever you think of to put the fire out is what we gotta do, right? So if you have ideas about the ways that we can address provider shortages, we want to know those things so we can try to figure out how to systematize and fund those stopgaps, those solutions, right? We also know that this is how our opponents work, right? They win in their state, and then they move to the next state where they think they need to win. We already have 3 people in the last 6 months who are leaders in the anti-abortion, anti-trans, and also anti-everybody who's not like white Christian nationalists, but specifically focused on those 2 issues, moving to New Mexico because they have said this is the next state where we will end these horrible policies that allow, and then whatever they say that we're doing, abortion up to birth and converting gender of kids without their permission, all of the things that they think we're doing, right? So they're coming here. So New Mexico has enjoyed this access for such a long time. We are seeing more protesters at our healthcare providers already. Those of us who have worked in these fields are seeing our pictures and information, and y'all, they don't take good pictures of me and then put them on the website, and I'm really upset, because like, I know I work here clothes in that, but they're putting us out in the world. They're making it clear to all of their, their cohort, all of their friends and family that they know hate us as much as they do. This is who's doing this work. So our providers, our patients, our staff, we're under continuous and ongoing and increasing scrutiny and attacks, right? And then also, we have providers who are considering moving to New Mexico to provide that access for us, for which I am super grateful. But also, like, that's a culture shift for them. Okay, cool. Like, you've been doing this in the Midwest for a long time. We don't look like that, right? Like, we don't talk like that, right? There's going to be a little bit of a learning curve for you when you get here, right? And then the reality is we have all kinds of community needs, right? Folks finally, and some of us have been saying this for a long time, and we saw on Tuesday, talking about things like LGBTQ protections and access to abortion is a winning political issue, because like, who would have thought most people want to control their own bodies, right? And it's not actually that scary, but we are behind the curve on community education, right? How many folks in this room think you have a good, or thought before I started talking, you had a good understanding of access to abortion and LGBTQ healthcare policies in New Mexico? Anybody felt like they really knew? Okay, that's pretty good. That's like clearly representative of our whole community, right? So we have to make sure folks know, where do you go? Who do you call? How do you make sure you end up at Planned Parenthood and not a crisis pregnancy center, right? How do you look up a doctor who's LGBTQ friendly that's not actually going to try to get you into a conversion therapy camp or like start preaching at you once you're in their exam room without clothes on, right? I don't know if that really happens, but I assume it probably does because people are evil. We need volunteers. Right? This movement is huge, and there is space for it everywhere, right? And so if you're the person that wants to knock on doors and do community education, great. If you're the person who wants to be an escort at clinics, great. If you want to do a bunch of data research and help us create a resource guide that we can share with folks, great. You want to be a trainer, go out and teach other people about how to talk in their communities, like there is space for all of these. You don't want to talk to people, EQNM and Planned Parenthood have data entry, and we have all of that space. But we're looking at this massive influx in New Mexico on LGBTQ and reproductive healthcare intersections, and there's a handful of us who are paid to do this, and we are not enough. We're absolutely not enough, right? And so my hope is that as folks are finding that anxious energy, that anger, that frustration, or the excitement of knowing that like we have it better in New Mexico than 47 other states in the country, and you want to keep making sure that that's true, we need all of the help we can get in all of those various spaces, right? And then last, like $10 million is amazing, and that's not going to fix our provider shortage, right? And the funding we have for the 988 system is going to be great, and that's going to help. That's not enough to fill the gaps for all of the behavioral health needs in the state, right? All of these various things, we have to find stable, ongoing, continuous, robust funding streams to continuously do that, right? I've been an organizer my entire adult life. I love relying on volunteers. Volunteers burn out, they get partners, they get jobs, they go away. We need the money to pay people to do this work, right? Because A, people should get paid for their labor, and B, because we want them to stick around long enough to learn it, do it, and then teach other people to do it. And that requires paying folks. So we have a lot to accomplish. So the very specific unfinished business that we have, this is our legislative agenda for EQ&M, Planned Parenthood, and the sort of broader coalition of organizations that we work with. This coming year is a 60-day legislative session. Because I keep referring to Tuesday, because as Robert said, things basically didn't change. Campaign staff and organizers' nightmare. We won a handful of additional pro-LGBTQ, pro-repro health seats in the state legislature, and then we lost the same amount, and our numbers are going to be exactly the same in our state house, which are good. 45-person majority out of 70 is good. I am not complaining, and also I'm complaining because y'all, that was 6 months of my life and we didn't change the deal. So it's just the personal frustration, right? But also, there's some real realities around our legislature. The Speaker of the House retired this year. The House parliamentarian, or basically the lawyer for the Democratic caucus, retired this year. Debbie Armstrong is a former cabinet secretary, a lawyer, a middle-aged white woman who could talk to both conservative and super progressive, both, right? We lost close to 40 years of historic knowledge and experience in the Democratic caucus in our state legislature. Yeah, going into a huge opportunity for transformative policy change. And in 1 hour, the House Democratic Caucus will meet to elect their leadership. I feel pretty good about who the Speaker of the House is going to be now. We don't know what the rest of the leadership schedule looks like, right? So we don't know what the makeup of committees are going to be. We don't know who is going to have the power on the floor. We have this big, bold, robust agenda, but please don't ask me how we're going to get it done. I'll tell you in a week when all of the dust is settled and we have an idea of who the personalities are and who's going to be controlling this stuff, right? Most of this are things that we've all been working on previously. And so right now there's a requirement to publicize with a paid newspaper ad a name change. It's archaic, it's ridiculous, it pretends like we don't live in a digital, like super big brother world, and like you can hide from your student loans if you change your name, they will find you. So we are hoping to get rid of that publication requirement for anybody who's legally changing their name. Obviously, in this context, that matters for trans folks, specifically, who shouldn't have to publicize to their rural community, or who just shouldn't have to pay the journal anything ever. I mean, in order to publicize their name change, right? But also for victims of domestic violence and victims and survivors, of domestic violence, for folks who have had a stalker at some point in their history, right? For people who just don't ever want their parents to find them again. That's not me yet. Right? Coming after the holidays. We don't have legislation to define and protect access to gender-affirming care. We don't know what that legislation is going to look like yet. We're talking with TGRC and Planned Parenthood and some other folks to think about, like, what does healthcare code look like in New Mexico? What's the best language, right? But we're going to have some proactive protections for trans folks in New Mexico. We are thinking about the ways that we normalize sexual and reproductive health care with primary care providers. Right? Planned Parenthood is overwhelmed with folks who need access to abortion care. I shouldn't be going to Planned Parenthood and taking that nurse practitioner's time to get my PrEP. It's not that hard. Just do my blood test and give me a script. But we clearly need to educate primary care providers, nurse practitioners, those sorts of folks, right? That means increasing access to PrEP and PEP. I must have just got distracted by CNN or something. We're thinking about local fights. What do we do at the state level to make sure, to what was brought up earlier, that Albuquerque doesn't pass some stupid, ridiculous, absolutely vile policy that says we're gonna out every queer and trans kid and every kid that's not doing well in math class. I mean, let's be real, this is harmful to every student, right? To just proactively give all of this information to parents. Like, yeah, they need to know some things about their kid, but also, like, that's what report cards are for. So you get those, I don't know, however often you get them, and that should be enough. It was enough for me to get in trouble twice a year, so that's good, right? We are also thinking about, how do we protect the parents of queer and trans youth if we were to have, maybe in the next 12 years, we won't have to worry about this, right? But at some point, we might have a Republican governor again, and they might look like Greg Abbott or Ron DeSantis, right? And so not physically, although, or probably physically they will look like Greg Abbott. And also, they will act like Greg Abbott in policy, right? So what do we put in state law now that prevents them from weaponizing children's and families departments in the future, right? And then, how do we protect patients coming to New Mexico for gender-affirming healthcare and for reproductive healthcare, right? In Texas, you can sue somebody for having or helping someone have an abortion, even if you don't have a vested interest in that case, which is so weird because they will throw that shit out when it comes to school shootings and providing guns to young people, but they want like your neighbor to sue you for having an abortion. So what do we do in New Mexico to make sure that somebody's lawsuit in Texas does not get them access to medical records in New Mexico? And that stuff is done regulatorily. We felt really confident about it, right? In fact, all those privacy laws I talked about earlier, those privacy laws and regulations exist because of our abortion access policies that we've had in place for so long, but we're in a brand new world. So we have to rewrite those laws to make sure that they protect folks from any other agency in any other state or any other community, right? And then what do we do to protect providers and their licenses? I mean, it is dangerous to be an abortion provider in this world. It's physically dangerous for our providers. What are we doing to make sure that they're safe in their communities? And then also that somebody can't file some frivolous and ridiculous complaint to get their license taken away. Right. So this is the this is the legislative agenda that we're going into this legislative session with, and I will just leave. I'm happy to take some questions and have conversation, but I will leave our contact information up for folks who may want to ask us questions or volunteer to work with Planned Parenthood or Equality New Mexico in any way, shape, or form.
So I think we need to keep our questions really limited. If there's one or two like really pressing ones, we'll take them, but we're running more and more behind. We will try to find time for other questions where they can be raised during lunch as well. And just one thing to add to where Marshall ended, which is to take us back to the discussion of SOGI, which was an executive order and still never put into legislation. So that's another unfinished piece of business, is to still try to get that passed in legislation so that when and if we have a governor that's not supportive of the work that's already started, whatever we've already done does not get undone with the stroke of a pen the way it was created now, right? So we're excited that we're moving forward. By the time anyone wants to undo it, they're going to have a whole lot of work to undo it, right? Which is great, because by the time we get through another term with Michelle, this will be so embedded in so many parts of our government that it would take probably more work and more attention than anyone's ever going to give to queers anyway. But we still want to get it into legislation so that it feels safer, that this is a long-term thing. Thanks, Marshall.
Yeah.
I think pregnancy crisis, treatment centers are obviously a major concern for choice and for human rights. I'm wondering what you think about the New Mexico Coalition for Reproductive Choice.
Yeah, I'll repeat the question.
I'll repeat the question.
So the question was two parts, right? Crisis pregnancy centers are extremely dangerous to literally everyone in the community in a lot of ways. And for folks who don't know what a crisis pregnancy center is, it's a place that will ask you if you're pregnant and scared and tell you they have resources to help you, and then they will string you along and convince you not to have an abortion, and then they will give you a package of diapers and a can of formula and say good luck and have a good life.
And I just want to say, part of why that's so harmful is that as healthcare providers, we're supposed to have a code of ethics, not make people do things or lead them one way or another, but to empower them to make choices that are right for them based on their values and their goals.
Exactly. And the problem with crisis pregnancy centers is they are not healthcare providers, and so they don't have any sort of, right? Like the most they might have is an ultrasound technician, and that person just has to provide non-biased information. So then the follow-up part of that question was the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice in New Mexico, which is an organization that's been around for 20 plus years, used to be on the board of that organization. They do phenomenal work, right? And I would encourage folks especially, so they have a couple of things. They have an abortion fund, so they help to fund access to abortion care for folks, and they have this amazing group of volunteers who pick people up from airports, who take them to their appointments, who house people who are traveling from across the state or across the country. They do really phenomenal work, and they do it from a faith-based perspective, because I don't know if folks know this, but like not everybody that goes to church hates gay people and abortion providers, right? In fact, I come from a long family of very devout Catholic women on my dad's side of the family who have been supporting access to abortion care since before Roe in this state and in our communities. And they did so because their faith taught them it was the right thing to do. So I love NMRCRC. Also, if you're, as I said, get in touch with EQNM and Planned Parenthood. And if what you want to do is not what we do, trust, we will connect you with the people who do what it is that you're good at and want to do. And we'll plug anybody into any of these movements. So thank you all so much. And I'll be around for a little while.
Thanks again, Marshall and Kayla, for your part in putting this together, even if you're not here with us. And we're going to hand over the mic to Fabian.